In the early 1970s, the world was experiencing a strange mix of euphoria and anxiety. The United States was emerging from decades of growth, having just passed through the golden years of the post-war era, but was mired in the Vietnam War, with rising inflation, looming unemployment, and a population increasingly distrustful of its own government. Families had televisions at home, watched presidents speak of prosperity and security, while experiencing firsthand the rising cost of living, the war consuming young people and money, and rumors about a dollar crisis and a gold rush beginning to appear in the news. De Gaulle asking for gold, American reserves falling, economists whispering that the Bretton Woods system was faltering. At that time, almost everyone still believed that behind every dollar bill, there was a well-guarded gold bar guaranteeing the value of that money. What no one knew was that this blind trust was about to be used as a central piece in one of the greatest rearrangements of economic power in modern history. The most counterintuitive thing is this: the problem might not be a lack of gold, but rather an excess of faith in a system that no longer needs it to control you. While you worry about your account balance, market prices, and credit card payments, there are people who have discovered how to transform paper into power, debt into control, crisis into opportunity, and they've been doing it for decades without ever appearing in the news. They understood that, in this game, whoever controls the flow of money, the markets, and the narrative about what is safe or responsible ends up ruling even those who have never heard of Bretton Woods, the petrodollar, or the gold window. In this video, the premise is simple yet profoundly unsettling: to open the Pandora's box of the gold bubble and show how the myth of American gold was used to build a financial power empire that no longer depends on metal bars, yet still governs your daily life. You'll see how France, warships, American presidents, central banks, and major markets connect in the same web of control, where gold is merely the most photogenic character in a much darker story. And, as these pieces fall into place, you might begin to realize something unsettling. Not knowing this until now wasn't bad luck, it was part of the script. The quick reward is clear: in the end, you won't leave here with magic tips to get rich overnight, but you will see the money that passes through your hands with different eyes, and that, in a system built on financial ignorance, is already a form of power. Because, from the moment you understand how the bubble was created, who really profits from it, and why nobody ever explained this to you in school, it becomes much harder to accept the role of an extra in this movie. And that's precisely why you need to stay until the end. Because the most delicate part of this story isn't what they did with the gold, it's what they did to your perception of it. And since you're here with an open mind to embark on this journey through the hidden heart of the money system, do the following: subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes of this saga about capitalism, financial power, and the inner workings of money. And while you're at it, comment below with two things: where you're watching from, city, country, even the time you're watching this, and what topic from the world of money, bubbles, banks, and markets you'd most like to see here. It could be Fort Knox, other financial families, new bubbles, central banks, anything. This way we can bring you increasingly sharp videos, aligned with the real questions of those within this community. Imagine someone growing up believing that behind every banknote circulating in their wallet lies a gleaming gold bar in some secret vault, guaranteeing all the country's wealth as if it were a divine insurance policy of capitalism. This has always been the story told to the average citizen: relax, the gold is there, the system is solid, the markets are safe, the government has everything under control. But when this person begins to truly study the money system, they realize that much of it is narrative, almost a well-packaged financial fairy tale designed to maintain collective confidence. Ultimately, what sustains the whole thing isn't the gold, but the belief that others will accept that piece of paper as if it were real wealth, as if it were liquid and immediate economic power. And that's where the bubble begins, when the symbol of money starts to matter more than the underlying asset itself, and gold becomes merely a supporting character in a much larger theater of control and manipulation. Throughout history, many governments have used gold as a kind of moral shield, as if to say to the people, we are responsible, our money has a solid foundation, we are different from those other countries that print money shamelessly. The rhetoric is beautiful, but in practice, the temptation to create money out of thin air, to finance wars, save banks, by political influence, has always been louder than any paper contract. While the citizen believes there is a direct relationship between the gold kept in vaults and the money in their pocket, those at the top of the system understand that the real game is psychological, based on trust and ignorance. It's the kind of convenient lie that keeps the markets running and economic power concentrated. And when someone questions where exactly the gold is and whether it really covers everything that has been issued, silence is usually the loudest answer. Fort Knox became the ultimate symbol of this story, the image of an impenetrable vault filled with bars stacked to the ceiling, guarding the heart of American wealth and the global money system. For years, documentaries, films, and political speeches used this place almost as an altar to capitalism, a temple where sacred gold would guarantee that nothing could go so wrong. But very few people have actually entered, almost no one has audited what actually exists there, and the few official visits were carefully choreographed, like a theatrical performance to quell suspicions. The obvious question, which almost no one dares to answer clearly, is, if everything is so solid and transparent, why so much fear of opening the curtains once and for all? And it is within this closed curtain that the perfect space for theories, manipulations, and, of course, bubbles of confidence resides. Consider a practical situation: someone who works their whole life, saves, buys government bonds, trusts the banking system because they've learned that it represents a slice of the country's gold, a share in that great national wealth. This person believes that, if everything goes wrong, the gold is there, secure, like the ultimate safety net. But, behind the scenes, what happens to the money issued, the deficits, the mass printing of currency to save companies, banks, and even other countries? The gap between real gold and the money in circulation grows like a silent bubble. The citizen continues to believe they are part of a solid system, while, in practice, they are embedded in a trust scheme where few have access to the real numbers and almost no one has access to the vault. It's like buying shares in a company that never publishes its balance sheet but constantly says everything is fine. This is just the beginning of the story, the moment when the viewer realizes that the relationship between gold, money, and economic power is far less obvious than they were taught in school. From here, things start to heat up. We'll delve into how the United States used this myth of gold to take control of the global financial system, how Bretton Woods transformed the dollar into the center of the markets, and, most importantly, how the decision to abandon the gold standard opened the doors to the true gold bubble, a bubble of confidence in gold that, in many respects, was gradually sidelined as the show went on. When the world emerged devastated from World War II, virtually every country was bankrupt, with little gold, much debt, and an urgent need to rebuild their economies and markets. In this chaotic scenario, the United States emerged as the great creditor, the country that had accumulated most of the world's gold within its vaults, including Fort Knox, while others burned resources in war. This imbalance gave the U.S. a level of financial power that no empire had ever had before in history. They not only had weapons and industry, but also the metal that everyone believed to be the true basis of the money system. And, as in any story of capitalism, whoever concentrates wealth and gold comes to dictate the rules of the game. It is in this context that Bretton Woods emerged, that 1944 conference where the major countries sat down to reorganize the global economy and avoid the financial chaos that led to the war. What seems like a technical agreement, full of numbers and economic terms, is in practice a total rewriting of the rules controlling the world's money supply. The proposal is simple and, at the same time, brilliant. The dollar becomes the reference currency, convertible into gold, and all other currencies are pegged to the dollar. In other words, if before the world looked directly to gold, now it looks to the dollar, and only the United States retains the key to the vault. It's as if the entire casino started accepting only chips from a single supplier, who, incidentally, is also the owner of the house. In practice, this means that while the average citizen continues to believe that money is backed by gold, what truly sustains the system is the American promise to convert dollars into gold when necessary. However, over time, this promise becomes symbolic, almost religious. The volume of dollars circulating globally grows much faster than the available gold, but confidence remains because everyone is bound by the same arrangement. Countries accumulate dollar reserves as if they were second-generation gold bars, accepting that their economic power depends on the stability and goodwill of the U.S. Gold, once the protagonist, becomes a luxury extra, used more as a narrative tool than as a real limit. A practical example helps to illustrate this. Imagine a country exporting products, oil, industrial goods, receiving dollars in exchange and keeping that currency in international reserves. On paper, this is wealth, a kind of national savings. But this wealth depends entirely on the strength of the dollar and the belief that it still represents, in some way, a piece of that stored gold. It's like someone exchanging years of work for casino chips, trusting that, in the end, they can return to the cashier and redeem them for something real. As long as everyone keeps playing, the system works. When someone tries to withdraw too much, the structure shows cracks. This architecture placed the United States in an unprecedented position of control over the global money system, by controlling the reserve currency, they began to directly influence the markets of virtually every country, effectively defining who has access to credit, who can sustain their wealth, and who remains hostage to the dollar. Instead of needing to occupy territories, it was enough to control the financial flow. And with that, gold was pushed to the background, while the real action was concentrated on printing money, interest rates, and the institutions created after Bretton Woods, such as the IMF and the World Bank. But the most interesting thing is that, even with this gigantic change, most people still believed, and many still believe, that everything is safe because there is gold in Fort Knox. Little did they know that the next big turning point was coming, and it would definitively break the link between gold, the dollar, and the notion of real wealth. At this point in the narrative, the world was already tied to the dollar, and global capitalism revolved around the American promise that every greenback had, deep down, a foot in the gold stored in vaults like Fort Knox. However, while most countries accepted this narrative and continued accumulating dollars as if they were pocket gold bars, France began to view this arrangement with almost aggressive skepticism. For them, blindly trusting another country's money, especially a country that was constantly financing war, deficits, and market expansion based on printing paper, was handing over economic power on a silver platter. So, little by little, Paris began to ask the uncomfortable question: what if we ask for the gold back? The French government, under Charles de Gaulle, did not want to depend forever on an American promise. It wanted real wealth, something that could not be devalued by decree or by a secret meeting of bankers. In public speeches, de Gaulle openly criticized the exorbitant privilege of the United States, this advantage of being able to pay the entire world with its own currency without the same risk as other countries. But the big move wasn't just talk. France began converting large volumes of dollars into gold, within the rules of Bretton Woods, as if to say, we're not going to stick with paper, we want the metal. It was a cold, calculated, almost silent move, but one that sent a clear message to those who understood the game: if everyone does this, the American treasury won't hold up. The scene that looks most like a movie script is the one where French ships heading to the United States in search of real gold. This wasn't internet theory, it was a real military ship, a cruiser, docking to load gold bars from the Federal Reserve and take them back to the Banque de France. Imagine this in the narration: an Allied power, in the midst of the Cold War, sending a visual message to the entire world: trust is good, counting bars is better. It's almost an elegant diplomatic humiliation, no need for threats, no need for shouting, just showing up with a ship to take the metal that, in theory, has always been theirs. This image perfectly illustrates how the money system depends on trust, but also on fear of being the last fool holding onto paper money when the gold runs out. Other countries began to think the same thing: if France is exchanging dollars for gold, perhaps it would be prudent to do the same, because there might not be enough gold for everyone. The math was brutal: years of deficits, war, and printing money had inflated the amount of dollars in circulation far beyond what American coffers could cover. While the population lived believing that the gold in Fort Knox was an eternal cushion of security, the more attentive governments realized that the system was, in practice, operating as a scheme in which only those first in line would be able to redeem the metal. Those last would be left with paper and a nice story. And, in a game of economic power, nobody wants to be last in line. This French move marks the moment when the bluff begins to unravel. The whole world realizes that, if things continue this way, the United States will have to choose between handing over the gold until it dries up or changing the rules of the game. It is precisely in this climate of growing distrust, with ships carrying bars and vaults being drained, that the next scene in your script gains maximum force. The American president appears on TV, with a grave tone, to announce that the gold window will be closed. From then on, the dollar ceases to be a convertible note and becomes pure trust, and that's where topic 3 comes in, showing how the Nixon shock shatters the illusion of gold backing and pushes the money system into a new era. There comes a point in every bubble when reality hits. In the case of gold and the dollar, that moment has a date and a name: August 1971, the famous Nixon shock. For years, the United States had been printing money, financing the Vietnam War, social programs, and an entire credit-based lifestyle, while promising the world that every dollar still had, deep down, a foot in gold. But other countries started cashing in. France, the United Kingdom, and others began exchanging their dollars for real gold, draining American reserves. The confidence bubble began to become dangerous because if everyone tried to withdraw at the same time, it would become obvious that there wasn't enough gold to cover the absurd amount of money in circulation. It was like that bank that works well until the day all the customers decide to withdraw at the same time. Pressed by inflation, deficits, war, and the threat of a global gold rush, Richard Nixon decided to take a desperate measure, but one sold to the public as a patriotic and necessary act. In a historic televised speech, he announced that the U.S. would suspend the conversion of dollars into gold temporarily. This magic word is very reminiscent of how certain governments use expressions like exceptional measure, only for a period, when, deep down, they know they are changing the game forever. In practice, Nixon closed the famous gold window, the door that allowed other countries, at least in theory, to transform their dollars into gold bars kept in American vaults. From then on, the dollar ceased to be a gold receipt and officially became a currency based on pure trust. The most ironic thing is how this was presented to the average citizen. Nixon talks about protecting the American worker, defending the country from speculative attacks, preserving the purchasing power of the people. At no point does he explicitly say that the Central Post-War Pact was being broken, that the whole world, in a way, had believed in a promise that could no longer be fulfilled without bankrupting the U.S. In simple terms, it was as if the casino owner said, "Folks, from today on the chips are still valid, but you can no longer exchange them for gold, trust me, it's for everyone's good." And, surprisingly, the system accepted it. Some complained, of course, but no one had a viable alternative. The bubble didn't burst in an immediate panic, it transformed into something even more abstract, a capitalism based on fiat money and a money system increasingly disconnected from any physical limits. In real life, this opened the door to a new kind of game with the markets and global economic power. Without the anchor of gold, governments and central banks gained enormous power to manipulate interest rates, print money, expand credit, and push problems into the future. The inflation of the 1970s, the asset bubbles, the debt boom, all of this takes on a new layer of meaning when you look at 1971 as the moment the brakes were applied. Gold still exists, of course, it's still stored, it's still used as a reserve, but it's no longer the final judge of the system. Now, those who control the money printer and the buttons of monetary policy are in charge. And this means the game has become even more favorable for those who already had financial power and access to the large capital markets. A useful mental exercise for the viewer is to think of it this way: if before there was, at least in theory, a physical limit to the amount of money that could exist, after 1971 that limit became a purely political and technical decision of a small group, presidents, central bankers, technocrats. This doesn't mean that everything immediately turned to chaos, but it profoundly transforms the nature of wealth. Wealth becomes less dependent on gold and more on who is positioned in the right flows of credit, debt, and financial assets. For the average citizen, who still believes that working, saving, and keeping in local currency is the safe path, this change is almost invisible. For those who understand the game, 1971 marks the definitive transition from the world of gold to the world of numbers on the screen, and it is precisely there that the gold bubble changes shape, leaves the vaults of Fort Knox, and begins to inflate in the stock markets, bonds, real estate, and everything that can serve as a store of value in a system without an anchor. After the official link between the dollar and gold was severed, money ceased to be, in practice, a receipt for something physical and became, primarily, a record of debt within the banking system. Instead of the bank simply safeguarding people's wealth, it began creating new money whenever it granted credit, expanding the amount of money in circulation with a few clicks and signatures. This transforms capitalism into a giant chessboard where almost everything is financed: houses, cars, businesses, education, entire governments. What seems like progress in modernity is also the fuel for a new, permanent bubble, where economic power is increasingly concentrated in those who control credit, set interest rates, and decide who deserves access to money created out of thin air. In this scenario, gold takes on a curious role. It ceases to dictate the money system, but becomes a kind of emotional plan B for those who fear the next crisis. Investors, governments, and even central banks continue to accumulate gold, but now as long-term insurance, while in the short term they ride the waves of markets inflated by liquidity and low interest rates. For the average citizen, this is confusing. On the one hand, they say that gold is a thing of the past; on the other, the great powers continue to silently hoard bars in their vaults. It's as if, in public, everyone swears allegiance to paper money and the numbers on the screen, but in private, they maintain a reserve of metal in case everything goes wrong. This double discourse is perfect for those who want to maintain control of the narrative and of their true wealth. In practice, starting in the 1970s, the world entered an era of vicious cycles. periods of easy credit, market booms, exploding asset prices, followed by crises that clean up the excess and justify even more central bank interventions. Every time a bubble bursts, whether in stocks, real estate, or any other asset, the solution tends to be the same: more money created, lower interest rates, more stimulus. This is great for those who already have wealth and can buy assets at low prices, and terrible for those who are trapped by wages, credit card debt, and bank loans. Inequality increases not only because some earn more, but because they understand the game. They position themselves where new money enters the system first, before it is diluted by inflation. A very concrete example for the viewer: when central banks lower interest rates to almost zero, large investors can borrow money cheaply to buy companies, stocks, and real estate, while the average citizen sees the return on savings dwindle and needs to take more risks to try to protect their money. Meanwhile, the price of everything that represents wealth, houses, land, stocks, businesses, skyrockets, creating the feeling that everything is too expensive. In reality, it's not that real estate has magically become valuable, it's that money has lost value, it has been diluted. Those who understand this enter the game as asset owners, those who don't understand keep pushing life along in installments, without realizing that they are financing the system that squeezes them. It's the kind of detail that separates those who are swallowed up by capitalism from those who manage to use the money system itself to their advantage. This new post-gold world is perfect for a specific type of control. It's no longer the explicit control of "we have the gold, we control everything," but a subtle control via credit, interest rates, crises, and bailout packages. Governments and central banks can decide which sectors receive liquidity, which companies are rescued, which markets are artificially supported. This creates almost untouchable financial elites who benefit at every stage of the cycle. They profit during expansion, are bailed out during crises, and even buy cheap assets when everyone else is in despair. Meanwhile, the average citizen continues to hear that it's all too complex and that the important thing is to work, pay bills, and trust that the system knows what it's doing. The gold, deep in the vault, watches silently, while the real game takes place on another table, much more sophisticated and much more dangerous. After 1971, gold lost its official role as the anchor of the money system, but Fort Knox continued to be treated as the great symbol of American wealth, almost an altar to capitalism and the economic power of the United States. However, there's a troubling detail: the more the system depends on trust and less on metal, the stranger it becomes that nobody, or almost nobody, can see what really exists inside that vault. The few permitted visits were highly choreographed, with selected politicians and journalists, without the right to a serious, independent audit, with bar-by-bar verification. It's as if the world has to accept, on faith, that the gold is there, intact, without being able to check the real stock that supposedly sustains part of the country's prestige. This lack of transparency fuels all possible theories, from the most moderate, which say that the gold was partially sold over the decades to cover deficits and secret operations, to the most extreme, which suggest that a large part of the bars was borrowed or remortgaged, becoming collateral and layer upon layer of financial contracts. In simple terms, the same gold could have been promised, on paper, to several creditors at the same time. This is perfect for a system based on trust and leverage, but a disaster if one day many people decide to demand physical delivery. The observer begins to realize that, in this modern money system, gold may exist, but it lives surrounded by so many promises and derivatives that no one can say for sure how many times it has been used behind the scenes. Meanwhile, central banks in other countries continue buying gold, increasing reserves, and even requesting the return of the metal that was stored abroad, in places like New York and London. Germany, for example, in recent years has organized a gradual process to repatriate part of its gold, precisely because it understood that eternally depending on the safekeeping of third parties is placing too much trust in a volatile geopolitical game. This reinforces the feeling that, at the top, at the level of those who control the markets, nobody took the idea that gold is a thing of the past very seriously. On the contrary, those in power continue to accumulate the metal, while the public is encouraged to think only in terms of digital numbers, credit, cards, and instant payments. Those looking from the outside see a pattern: the top protects itself with hard assets, the bottom lives on promises. The most curious thing is that the average citizen almost never sees this discussion clearly presented. Instead, they are bombarded with headlines about the stock market, interest rates, inflation, and public debt, but rarely does anyone explain how the real gold reserves, the supposed bottom of the barrel of the system, are treated with a level of secrecy that doesn't align with the transparency propaganda of modern democracies. If gold is no longer so important, why so much mystery? If it's still crucial, why not show it? This kind of contradiction is the perfect fuel for good storytelling. The audience senses that something is wrong, but can't pinpoint exactly where. And it's in this climate of doubt, closed vaults, and Shane promises that the video can begin to raise the next question: if gold has become a secondary character, what exactly sustains the power of those who control the money system today? After the dollar officially decoupled from gold, many people thought the system would collapse, that American capitalism would lose its luster, and that global markets would crumble due to the lack of a physical backing. But in practice, something else happened. Instead of backing money with bars and vaults, the United States tied the dollar's value to something even more strategic: oil. In discreet agreements with major Middle Eastern producers, led by Saudi Arabia, the US helped create a simple and powerful logic: oil, the planet's main source of energy, would be sold in dollars. This meant that any country that wanted to keep its economy running, its cars on the road, its industries producing, would first need to secure access to dollars. Suddenly, the entire world remained dependent on the American currency, even without the so-called gold window. This is where the concept of the petrodollar enters as the new heart of the global money system. Oil begins to function as an indirect backing for the dollar, not through official contracts, but out of pure practical necessity. Countries sell products, services, and technology and receive dollars. With these dollars, they buy oil. With the oil, they keep their economies open. It's a clever cycle in which the economic power of the US no longer comes from promising gold, but from controlling the flow of the currency that buys the world's energy. In terms of storytelling, it's almost as if gold has left the scene and, in its place, a black, flammable liquid has entered, much more useful and much easier to use as a tool of geopolitical control. In real life, this has transformed the dollar into something more than just a national currency. It becomes a kind of key to accessing global capitalism, credit, and major financial markets. Banks, funds, governments all need dollar exposure, not only to trade but also to protect themselves from crises. This maintains a constant demand for the American currency, even when the US prints gigantic amounts of money to save banks, buy bonds, finance wars, or contain recessions. The trick is that, while the world needs dollars to buy energy and participate in global markets, the extra supply of money doesn't completely undermine confidence. Whoever controls this liquidity tap controls a large part of the flow of wealth and financial power on the planet. With this, the very concept of backing changes. It's no longer a direct relationship between paper money and gold bars, but a complex web that mixes energy, debt, trust, and military power. The average citizen, who still imagines that the value of money comes from some hidden reserve, doesn't realize that, in practice, the system works like a pact. The world accepts dollars because it knows they buy oil and circulate in the main markets, and the US uses this privilege to maintain its standard of living, its military machine, and its dominance over the global financial system. For your video, this shift from gold to oil is a great moment to show that, even when the metal loses the spotlight, the control game of the money system continues, only the scenery changes. With the petrodollar containing global demand for the dollar and central banks freed from the physical constraints of gold, the system gained an almost infinite capacity to create money and credit. However, this new money doesn't reach everyone equally. It first enters through large banks, governments, and institutional players, who decide where this liquidity goes. And guess what? It rarely goes directly into the worker's pocket. It rushes to where it can become more wealth and more control: stock markets, bonds, real estate, mergers, share buybacks. The result is a capitalism where asset prices skyrocket, while the wages of those at the bottom barely keep up with inflation. The top transforms money created out of thin air into real wealth. The bottom transforms real labor into money that loses value. That's why, after the 1980s, the world began to see an almost uninterrupted sequence of bubbles: Japan, dot-coms, real estate in 2008, tech again, crypto, all inflated by a combination of low interest rates, abundant credit, and an almost religious belief that markets always adjust in the long term. But for those attentive to the money system, it doesn't seem like an adjustment. It seems like a vicious cycle where each crisis is fought with even more liquidity, increasing the next bubble. Governments and central banks become firefighters of a fire they themselves fuel. They extinguish today's fire by throwing financial gasoline that ignites tomorrow. Those who know how to position themselves ride these waves. Those who don't, always enter late, buy at the top, sell at the bottom, and return to the rat race. In practice, the new gold of the elites is anything that easy money can inflate before it reaches the real economy. shares in large companies, prime land, commercial buildings, stakes in strategic businesses. This is where financial power multiplies, because these assets appreciate much faster than the average salary or traditional savings. The average citizen, who doesn't understand this mechanism, remains trapped in financial products that barely protect against inflation, while watching the price of housing, rent, and opportunities rise like a runaway elevator. When they try to get in on the action, it's usually too late. The insiders are already leaving through the back door and preparing for the next cycle. One example that viewers can easily experience is the real estate market. In several countries, property prices have skyrocketed far beyond what average income can afford, especially after years of artificially low interest rates. This isn't just natural demand, it's cheap, abundant money looking for anywhere to park and become long-term wealth. Large funds and institutional investors buy entire neighborhoods, condominiums, and buildings as if they were stocks, transforming housing, a basic need, into a chess piece in a global game of profitability. The result is that a portion of the population spends their entire lives renting, while another accumulates assets that appreciate with the same logic as a rising stock. This process subtly reveals how the control of the money system determines who rises and who remains trapped at the bottom of the pyramid. Those near the top of liquidity transform numbers on screens into properties, companies, and political power. Those far away trade their time for depreciating money. Physical gold, locked in vaults, becomes almost a nostalgic symbol, while modern gold consists of financial assets that only a few know how to navigate. And, little by little, the viewer begins to realize that the real bubble is not just the gold bubble, nor just the oil bubble. It's a bubble of confidence in a system that only works because the majority doesn't understand the rules. And, of course, this opens the way for the next step in the script, to show what the average citizen can do to stop being just a bystander in this grand theater of capitalism. After setting up this whole chessboard, gold in the vaults, the dollar dominating, the petrodollar holding back demand, and asset bubbles enriching those with access to the big markets, the most painful point remains to be shown. Those who pay the price for all of this are precisely those who least understand the money system. The average citizen contributes what they value most, their lifetime and labor. In return, they receive money that is eroded by the invisible tax of inflation, while watching the wealth of those at the top multiply at a much faster rate. It's like running on a treadmill. No matter how hard a person tries, the system only accelerates a little more so that they remain almost in the same place. The combination of direct taxes, debt interest, and inflation functions as a silent mechanism for transferring economic power from the bottom up. When governments borrow and central banks create new money to sustain spending and bail out crises, this money enters the system before it translates into price increases. It first passes through banks, large corporations, and investors who use this liquidity to buy assets, stocks, real estate, businesses that are still cheap. Only then does this money reach the real economy, raising prices, rents, and the cost of living. Those at the bottom bear the brunt of the impact. They work more, pay more, and are told that it's the fault of market greed or global conditions. In practice, it's an elegant way to use the population's own effort as fuel to keep financial capitalism running. A very real-life example: a person works, receives a salary, pays income taxes, buys products with embedded taxes, finances a house with interest, and still sees their money lose value year after year. They try to save a little, sometimes in a conservative investment, but are overwhelmed by price bubbles in basic things like housing and education. Meanwhile, those who understand the game use cheap credit to buy assets and leverage businesses, transforming good debt into more wealth. For the average worker, debt usually means maxed out credit cards and never-ending financing. For those at the top, debt is a leverage tool in global markets. Both use the same word, debt, but are playing completely different sports. And to keep all this running, it's essential that most people don't see the workings behind the numbers. The official narrative insists that the system is too complex, that it's better to leave money decisions to experts, technocrats, and monetary authorities. Thus, citizens become accustomed to discussing only the tip of the iceberg, the price of gasoline, rent, the dollar, without connecting it to the larger arrangement of petrodollars, infinite credit, and the concentration of financial power. They feel the pain, but don't see the structure. And while public conversation remains stuck in superficial debates, those who control the money flows, the markets, and the large institutions continue to adjust the system in their own favor, with an almost cynical calm. This is the point where the viewer begins to realize that the gold bubble isn't just about bars locked in Fort Knox. It's about a bubble of illusions that makes the worker believe they're playing the same game as the big players, when in reality, they are the energy source that keeps the machine running. The question that remains, and which sets the stage for the next topic, is simple and unsettling. If the system was designed to work this way, is there any way to use the rules of capitalism itself to escape this role of mere extra and begin, even on a small scale, to build a type of wealth that doesn't depend solely on the goodwill of those who control the money system? By this point, the viewer has already understood that the money system was designed to concentrate economic power at the top, using gold, dollars, oil, debt, and inflated markets as gears in a large engine of global capitalism. But if they leave this video only feeling indignant, nothing changes. The key here is to show that, even in an unjust system, there are loopholes, ways to stop being just fuel and start, little by little, to position oneself on the side of those who benefit from the flows of money, not just those who suffer the impacts. It's not about becoming a billionaire overnight, but about stopping playing a game where you work, pay taxes, take out expensive loans, and watch the wealth of others explode. It's about becoming, even on a small scale, a partner in capitalism instead of just a customer. A first concrete step is understanding the difference between consuming the system and owning small pieces of it. Those who only consume pay rent, interest, fees, monthly payments. Those who own participate in companies, real estate, indices, and businesses. In simple terms, spending all your money on things that lose value is working against yourself. Using part of your money to buy assets that grow along with the markets is placing yourself, even timidly, on the side of those who receive the fruits of the system. This can start with very accessible things, broad market ETFs, like the S&P 500, MSCI World, real estate funds, or shares of large and stable companies that benefit precisely from this world inflated by liquidity. Instead of just complaining that the rich get richer, a person begins to expose themselves, even with little, to the same movements that fuel the wealth of those at the top. Another hack is learning to view interest rates, inflation, and debt as double-edged swords, not as abstract monsters. Consumer debt, with high interest rates, is the chain that binds. Debt used with discipline to acquire productive assets can become leverage. A practical example: financing an overly expensive car that depreciates and drains your money is very different from using credit, very carefully, to invest in something that generates income, a small business, a qualification that truly increases earning power, or even a well-thought-out property for rental. The same logic applies to inflation. Those who only keep money idle in checking accounts lose purchasing power. Those who convert part of their savings into assets that tend to keep pace with or exceed inflation, good properties, solid companies, index funds, are, in practice, protecting themselves from the invisible tax that erodes everyone's work. This also brings up a point that almost no one teaches: financial education is not a luxury, it's self-defense. Reading books like The Richest Man in Babylon, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, The Psychology of Money, or historical studies on bubbles and crises is not a fad, it's learning the language of the system that decides the future of your life. The more a person understands how capitalism really works, with its bubbles, its cycles, its tricks, the less they fall for the just work hard line, and the more they start thinking in terms of capital allocation, risk, opportunities, and wealth protection. And this applies both to those starting from scratch and to those who already earn well but still live a lifestyle where every increase in income translates into increased spending, never increased assets. Of course, none of this changes the fact that the game is unequal. Those close to the source of money, cheap credit, and insider information still have a brutal advantage over the rest. However, if the spectator does nothing, they automatically remain in the worst position on the board. What this topic proposes is the beginning of a change in mindset, to look at one's own money not as an end in itself, but as a tool to buy time, security, and real participation in the markets. And, as one understands this, an inevitable question begins to arise, which prepares the ground for the next topic: if this logic is so powerful, why does almost no one teach it in schools, companies, or families, and who really benefits from keeping the majority ignorant about how the money system, capitalism, and the money game itself work? At the same time, the dominant discourse treats any attempt to question this system as a conspiracy theory or oversimplification of something complex. Of course, the money system is complex, it was designed to be. But too much complexity, without transparency, becomes a smokescreen. It's easy to label as paranoid anyone who asks too many questions about gold audits, the behind the scenes of Bretton Woods, petrodollar deals, or selective bailouts of banks and large companies. This label serves a purpose: to distance the average citizen from the conversations that define the future of the markets and collective wealth itself. Meanwhile, those within the circles of power openly discuss interest rates, liquidity, derivatives, leverage, because they know that's where the real game happens. Ultimately, the combined effect is simple and brutal. The system transforms the majority into spectators of a financial movie that impacts everything in their lives, but whose script they have never seen in its entirety. People feel the weight of rent, inflation, crises, unemployment, credit cuts, but rarely understand how these waves originate at the top, in the decisions of a few. And that's precisely why a video like this has so much potential. It won't change capitalism, it won't open Fort Knox, it won't bring down the petrodollar, but it can change something even more important, which is how the viewer sees money, wealth, and their own role in this game. And when perception changes, the way of acting also begins to change. But that's another story, the story of how to use all this not only to protect oneself, but to turn the game in one's favor, even if only on an individual scale, while the empire of money continues out there pretending that none of this is happening. Are there any other bubbles you'd like me to tell you about, or would you prefer to always be surprised? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the next video.